It brings me a special kind of gratification that Xenoblade Chronicles X exists. Not only that it exists though, but that it had a worldwide release and proper marketing. You see, it wasn't that long ago that I was part of an extensive letter writing campaign to get the original Xenoblade released outside of Japan. Now, nearly 3.5 years later, I was able to walk into a store, pick up its sequel, or to put it more accurately, spiritual successor, without any hassle whatsoever. I don't think there are adequate words to express how uniquely satisfying it is for me to say that, but it feels really, really good. Xenoblade Chronicles X was developed by Monolith Soft, a company whose origins reach back into the late 90s. After Squaresoft refused to give the green light for a sequel to Xenogears, director Tetsuya Takahashi decided to part ways with the company and form his own studio with producer Hirohide Sugiura. After accepting a large investment from Namco, Monolith began working on an incredibly ambitious project titled Xenosaga, which was intended to be a 6-part epic and was rumored to span nearly a decade and 3 console generations. For reasons I won't get into now, that vision never came to full fruition, but between the development of Xenosaga 1 and 2, I had my first introduction to Monolith Soft with the release of Baten Kaitos, Eternal Wings and the Lost Ocean on the GameCube in 2003. While not one of my favorite RPGs of all time, Baten Kaitos was a solidly designed game, and back in those days Nintendo fans were desperate for RPGs on the GameCube. Due to Monolith's excellent work on Baten Kaitos and its prequel, as well as Xenosaga's woes leading into the mid-2000s, Nintendo ended up purchasing controlling interest in the company after Namco sold 80% of its 96% stake in Monolith Soft, and soon after ended up selling the remaining 16% as well, which effectively made Takahashi's little studio a first-party developer for Nintendo. After some collaborative work on Super Smash Bros. Brawl, as well as an eventual successful worldwide release of Xenoblade Chronicles, the company had both the backing and the motivation to move forward on some of Takahashi's larger ambitions. As mentioned previously, Xenoblade Chronicles X is not a true sequel to Xenoblade Chronicles, but a spiritual successor. It carries over many features from its predecessor, which include an MMO-style arts palette that can be cycled through during battle, similar quest design and inventory management systems, and a massive open-world structure that promotes exploration. You can look at Xenoblade Chronicles X in very much the same way you do with Final Fantasy sequels, or Dark Souls and Bloodborne in relation to Demon Souls. It borrows similar design philosophies and architecture from the original game and expands upon them, while the story remains completely unrelated. The similarity, for me, is both a good and a bad thing. It's good because the original Xenoblade was a great game, and as long as the developers didn't try to fix what wasn't broken, they were sure to have another solid RPG on their hands. However, I do wish they would have made some further alterations to the game's quest structure, which can be filled with just as much tedious busywork as the first game was if you want to attempt a completionist run. For the most part though, I can say I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Xenoblade Chronicles X. Its beautiful world, engaging battle system, and intriguing story concept kept me wholly invested throughout my now 200+ hours with the game, though I definitely feel there are some places where it could have been tightened up a bit. With all of its ambition and attempts to appear as large and expansive as its AAA competitors, Xenoblade Chronicles X ended up feeling a little bloated to me, and in my opinion could have benefited from removing certain ideas in order to bring greater clarity and focus to executing its storytelling and other more promising gameplay features. Xenoblade Chronicles X begins in Earth's near future, where humanity finds itself hopelessly entangled in a war between 2 powerful alien races. Knowing that mankind is no match for these advanced civilizations, the governments of Earth organize a massive exodus and attempt to flee aboard colossal interstellar migrant ships in hopes of colonizing other worlds and securing a future for the human race. Only a handful of these ships are able to escape the collateral damage caused by the aliens' devastating weapons, however, and the tale of one of these arcs, the White Whale, becomes the focus of our story. 2 years after the destruction of Earth, one of the invading alien species catches up to the White Whale and damages it, causing it to crash land on the nearest habitable planet called Mira. With the ship's main survival habitat undamaged, mankind rises from the ashes of its near extinction and begins exploring this new world, one in which it will have to learn to coexist with the beautiful yet threatening indigenous species if it hopes to survive. This backdrop sets the stage for a tale of survival, which takes a very different tone to that of the original Xenoblade. Both narratives have their strong points and weaknesses, but the original certainly felt like it had more of an imperative spirit to me, not because the stakes were necessarily higher for the characters involved, but because it was paced in such a way that the next step forward always felt pressing and critical. I also appreciated how the developers gave the player freedom to move forward at his or her own pace, so if you didn't want to get caught up in the overwhelming mass of side content the game had to offer, you could just continue with the story at a traditional pace. This isn't really the case in Xenoblade Chronicles X, which may or may not be an annoyance depending on the kind of player you are. Narrative is generally one of the most important features of a single-player experience for me, and playing through a game's story is typically what I anticipate the most. So it was disappointing to me that most of the game's story missions are locked behind progression requirements. These requirements generally involve exploring a certain percentage of the game's world and completing affinity missions. Affinity missions are essentially optional side quests, excluding the ones included as progression requirements, that are meant to give background to the characters, and for the most part, they're really well thought out and solidly designed quests that offer much needed characterization. Of all the side content in the game, the affinity missions are my favorite because of this background that they provide for the characters. But as with the main story missions, many of them are locked, but in this case behind affinity requirements. This means you can't begin the mission until you've reached a certain level of affinity with the required character, and raising affinity outside of engaging in these affinity quests can take a really long time. Luckily, for all the required affinity missions, you won't be obligated to raise affinity very high, so it shouldn't be too much of a barrier in completing the main story if that's what you're interested in. Heart-to-hearts also make a return, and function in pretty much exactly the same way as they did in the original Xenoblade. However, I think it's important to mention that after completing my first run, I only discovered that heart-to-hearts are even in the game at all after discussing it with a player online in a forum. Yes, you heard that right, I had played for pretty close to 200 hours and never encountered a single one. These optional scenes of dialogue give even further depth to the characters and continue to boost affinity. But I think the important thing to point out here is that it's possible to miss them entirely, because the game never really informs you about them. In fact, this game actually explains very little about its massive wealth of features to the player, requiring you instead to discover these nuances on your own through experimentation. If you're the kind of player who's irritated by modern AAA developers and all the hand-holding they do these days, then you may find that there's a lot for you to discover on your own with Xenoblade Chronicles X. However, I do think that in some ways the developers have taken this a little too far, making it difficult from time to time to figure out something as simple as using a consumable item. This is largely due to the fact that Xenoblade Chronicles X has a pretty unintuitive user interface, even for players highly experienced with the genre. I've been playing JRPGs for roughly 18 years, so it's pretty rare for me to pick up a game and not have a fairly immediate idea how to navigate menus, equip my characters, and customize their abilities. In this game, however, while most of the basic things can be quickly understood, there are a lot of the deeper refinements where the true, subtle strategy of the game comes into play that the game never attempts to explain. Again, this may be good news to you if you enjoy discovering how the game works on your own without walls and walls of tutorial text to guide you through every single point. But for those who don't like to waste a lot of time fumbling through menus trying to figure out what they're doing, or simply don't have the freedom to invest the kind of time that this game requires, you might find yourself pretty frustrated. The developers tried to make up for this by including a massive digital manual that covers a lot of material not provided in the tutorials. If you pick this game up, I highly suggest that you not ignore this valuable resource, as it really does explain so much that is necessary if you want to get the most out of your experience with the game. It won't give you an all-encompassing knowledge, that still has to come through experimenting on your own, but it's a great starting point to get the ball rolling. I don't personally like that this information is all packed into a manual rather than explained with clever quest structure at a smooth pace over the course of a very long game, but I believe this was a choice made by the developers intentionally to get the players more heavily involved in a serious attempt to understand all the mechanics. And to their credit, I think it works, as long as you dedicate the time and effort necessary to do so. I have to say that despite my problems with how the story missions are broken up by progress requirements, which really hurts the pacing, it does force you to sit down and figure out a lot of the mechanics that may have seemed intimidating at first. In my experience, I learned the most during these periods between the story missions when I was attempting to fulfill all the progress requirements. In one way, this can be seen as brilliantly subtle design, but it does come at the cost of hurting the pace of the story. The battle system functions very similarly to the original Xenoblade, but with a few refinements and additions that give it more depth. The arts palette, importance of position on the battlefield when performing certain attacks, and emphasis on using arts in a specific chain or combo are all still present here, but new ideas have been implemented as well. One example of this comes in the form of enemies who have multiple appendages that can be targeted and broken. Doing so will weaken the monster, prevent it from using certain dangerous attacks, or cause the knockback debuff. This can be done by targeting the appendage you want to destroy and ordering your team to concentrate fire, which will make every member in your party focus their attacks on what the player is targeted on. This can be a huge game changer against large enemies that are higher in level than you, and adds a layer of depth to the battle system that can decidedly help or hurt your combat prowess depending on how you're utilizing it. The same can be said for the way the player utilizes soul voices and the overdrive system, which seem deceptively simple at first, but actually contain, as with most features of this game, subtle layers of depth that can radically change how effective you are in battles. Understanding these principles will take you from barely being able to survive a boss fight, even at a level that is higher than the average of the enemies you're facing, to crushing them at lower levels. The depth really is there, and it's incredibly satisfying to master. All of these features, as well as others like the class-changing system, which is unfortunately limited to the main player avatar, give this game a substantial level of customization and new playstyles that weren't available in the first game. From a presentation standpoint, I feel that this game mostly delivers, but there are some hiccups, especially when it comes to sound design. Visually, sacrifices were made to the fidelity of the finer details of the models, which is especially apparent when you compare them to other current-gen games. But this was done for the purpose of blowing the player away with an unmatched sense of scope. And in that sense, this game succeeds in a triumphant fashion. I can't fully express what a joy it is to explore these enormous, gorgeous landscapes filled with mammoth creatures, but honestly, it's what I would describe as the game's defining feature. And once you're able to take to the skies in a Skell, the feeling is only proliferated. It's exhilarating, it really is. However, there are several issues I have with the music and sound design. Let's talk about the sound design first. This may have bothered me specifically because I'm a sound designer myself, but there are a lot of samples in this game that are either used far too often, or just lack the proper impact that you would expect from the action you're seeing on screen. I notice this most often with footprints and swimming. In other areas, the sound is also just really poorly balanced. The music volume in particular is just far too loud, to the point where it's very difficult and sometimes impossible to understand what the characters are saying during cutscenes without subtitles. There's honestly just no excuse for this, especially since there's no slider for music volume so that the player can adjust it themselves. You just have to deal with it, which is again a very disappointing thing for someone like me who does this for a living. As for the music itself, I feel really torn about it. There are some tracks that are just breathtaking. The main theme of the game is especially powerful, and the themes for the different continents you can explore are also amazing. However, this is only the second video game that composer Hiroyuki Sawano has ever worked on, with a large body of his work coming from anime projects. And honestly, that quality really shines through. His use of vocals in particular is often puzzling to me, not just for its tonal qualities within a piece, but for the awkwardly translated lyrics, which are generally really corny and don't supplement many of the track's expression or artistic mood, especially when considering that the music is meant to set the tone for an area. The most infamous example of this is the NLA theme, which you kind of have to hear to understand where all the animosity from players is coming from. This was something that initially distracted and annoyed me, but I eventually sort of settled into it, and it no longer bothered me after about 20 hours with the game. There were even some pieces that I initially didn't think fit particularly well that I ended up enjoying by the time I finished the game. Overall, the soundtrack is decent, but there were definitely some strange choices made by the composer. and for that reason, this soundtrack comes nowhere near approaching the monumental quality of the original Xenoblade, which has one of the greatest soundtracks of all time. On the flip side, I did think that the voice cast was well chosen. There's no one here that necessarily stands out as being truly excellent, but none of the dialogue is delivered in a way that will make you roll your eyes. There is some writing in the final chapters that made me do so, but the delivery of the lines for the most part is really strong. However, a lot of players who loved the first game might miss the exaggerative, over-the-top quality of the British voice cast, and may look at the more level performances in Xenoblade Chronicles X as lacking personality. This sentiment may also carry over into their opinions of the characters themselves, who many consider to be underwhelming. I don't dislike them, but I have to admit that there's no one who really stands out as a strong, well-developed character. There's even one, a Nopon named Tatsu, who is an example of just the worst kind of trope character. For those who have seen my review of the original Xenoblade, you'll know I wasn't fond of Ricky, but at least he was useful in the sense that he could fight with your party and actually had some powerful abilities. Tatsu, on the other hand, exists only as a mechanism to offer comic relief, but the problem is he isn't very funny. He does have a few good moments, I'll admit that, but his recurring joke with Lyn is best described as nauseating, especially after the 100th time it's been repeated. Opinions on all of this, of course, will vary between players depending on how diligently they seek for background information with the optional affinity missions and heart-to-hearts, but if we're speaking strictly from a main story perspective, there's just not a lot of character development to speak of in this game. This problem is compounded by the fact that the main player avatar is a silent protagonist, and on that point, I'll have to say that I don't agree with the choice. I did like that the player avatar was more of an observer and contributor to the events of the game, rather than the typical chosen hero archetype, but I still feel like there are more cons than pros for this decision. I found it pretty distracting that whenever an NPC would ask the player avatar a question, everything, including video, sound, and music, would simply halt until you selected from one of two options. For the most part, these choices have little to no consequence, which made me question the purpose of including this feature at all. There are a few side quests where the choices you make matter, and will have a large effect on the outcome of the mission and sometimes even create permanent changes in the world, but these examples are few and far between, and there exists one egregious example of the classic JRPG cliché of being asked a question that only has one answer, and despite how many times the player tries to choose the alternative, the game simply won't let you. This is made even sillier by the fact that Elma makes it perfectly clear and repeats many times that the decision to join Blade is entirely your own, and that the player shouldn't feel pressured one way or the other. It turns out, though, that the player really has no choice at all, so why all this BS about giving me a choice? This is merely one case in many of this game's inclusion of features that make the whole of the experience feel like it lacks focus. I get the feeling from playing this game that it's bloated with unnecessary features, and in certain areas where it could have benefited from greater polish, you have in place of that polish a feature that the game could have easily done without. While I admittedly didn't get much of a chance to try the online play, mostly because the Wi-Fi connection in my bedroom is horrendous and I spent more time looking at this screen than actually playing online, I have spent some time watching other people's experiences with it on YouTube, and to me, it doesn't really appear to offer much aside from kill quests that you can participate in with other players. Perhaps the rewards for completing them make them more appealing, but as I said, I couldn't stay connected long enough to try one myself, so there's not much perspective I can offer here. The online functionality goes beyond just partying up with other players though, extending even into the core single-player experience, where specific tasks can be completed to unlock new squad missions and obtain reward tickets that can be traded in for materials. There can be up to 32 players at once participating in completing these objectives, which is a pretty unobtrusive and clever way of integrating online interaction. I will say that it's nice that all of this is supplemental, and none of it is thrown in your face. You can choose to engage in it if you'd like, or ignore it if you don't care to try it at all. However, I wondered if these features were really necessary, and if by cutting them out, the developers could have pulled more focus into other areas to balance the game and make it feel tighter and more cohesive. The endgame grind is especially grueling, where obtaining high-level equipment and level 50 skells becomes incredibly expensive. That sharp curve seems to be smoother for players who really take their time completing side quests, however. If you're like me though, and your primary focus is experiencing the story, then the late game might feel arduous and punishing. If you balance out the amount of side content you do throughout the entire experience, however, rather than doing only what's required to move forward with the story, this shouldn't be too much of an issue for you. I have to say though, despite all of my grievances and nitpicking, that the overall experience with Xenoblade Chronicles X has been immensely satisfying. It's not often that we get massive JRPGs like this, and in the areas where it counts, this game delivers for me. The only reason I'm so hard on it is because I see so much potential, and I really want to see games like this succeed. However, the majesty of its open world, which is simply riveting to explore, is reason alone to justify my purchase of the game. In addition to that, however, is a fast-paced, engaging battle system that has some incredible depth for those who really apply themselves, a brilliant story concept with some genuinely unique and unpredictable twists, and an abundance of customization options. While some of the game's features might seem cryptic and ambiguous to some, others will find an opportunity that rarely presents itself in modern game design philosophy. An opportunity to discover an acute and complex experience that is incredibly satisfying to master. While there are certainly problems with the game, those problems don't come anywhere close to being a detriment to the total package being offered here. If you're a fan of JRPGs, and especially of the first Xenoblade, you definitely don't want to miss this one. I wholeheartedly recommend it for anyone who can invest the time. I really don't think you'll regret it.